it's Miss Blanchard with our second video, a brief look at the beginning of World War I, also known as the war to end all wars, at the time known as the Great War. So a question to begin the lecture with is to think about what were the competing foreign relation ideologies in America from 1900 to 1920. Sorry, just noticed the typo. And these are going to lead into some of the causes of the Great War, not in America because the Great War starts in Europe, but rather like on a global scale, and eventually why America decides to stay isolationist for so long and then eventually enter the war. So why did World War I begin? To understand that, you have to understand the politics that had been going on in Europe throughout the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. There had been intense competition and rivalry between Britain and Germany, leading up into two competing camps, the Triple Alliance there in Central Europe, and the Triple Entente made up of Great Britain, France, and Russia. And a lot of this had a lot of similarities with America at the time in terms of competition for natural resources in overseas markets, aka imperialism. The alliances did a good job at preventing small problems from spiraling out of control into larger problems, but ended up embroiling all of Europe into World War I. So the first act of war was on June 28, 1914, when this man, Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist, assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand. Really, to understand the depths of this, why this was caused, it goes back at least 20 years to when Serbia was being placed more and more under control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of which Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the next in line for the Austrian throne. So that can be considered our first act of war, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Though this in and of itself is not enough to cause the outbreak of World War I. A month later, the Austrian government, under pressure from Germany, retaliates by invading Serbia. Serbia, though, is under the protection of Russia, so on August 1st, Germany, the ally of Austria, declares war against Russia because of that alliance. To cover their bases, so to speak, they also declare war against France and instill something called the Schlieffen Plan, which is to invade Belgium as the fastest route to France in event of a war. England then comes to the aid of her allies, Russia and France, from that Triple Entente, and declares war back on Germany. All of this taking place in the first 4 days of August. And this is what escalates from an assassination attempt to a world war.
When all was said and done, counting colonies and spheres of influence, the world map would eventually look like this. You'll never guess who wins. So there were many opportunities not to mobilize and declare war, none of which were taken. Some blamed the web of alliances itself, which is what Woodrow Wilson wanted to fix with the League of Nations. Some blame Russia, the first big country to mobilize. Some blame Germany for the inflexibility of the Schlieffen Plan. Leninists claim the war grew out of imperialism and was fueled by capitalist rivalries. And others claim it was a war between Germany's radical modernism and Britain's traditional conservatism. But if I had to assign blame, I'd go with the alliance system and the cultural belief that war was, in general, good for nations. War helped define who was them and who was us, and doing that strengthened the idea of us. And before World War I, war was perceived to be necessary and often even glorious.
So this is what Europe looks like during the war. You're going to have the Allied powers on the periphery and the Central powers there in the middle in Central Europe making a two-fronted war. Our first front is the Western Front. This is what inspired books like All Quiet on the Western Front and included battles like the Somme and Verdun. On the Eastern Front, what's a famous battle on the Eastern Front? You have other battles, but mainly fought between German and Russian soldiers.
Trench warfare on the Western Front is most famous for its brutal futility. Great Britain and France on one side, Germany on the other, with no man's land in between. World War I was a writer's war, and there's a lot of metaphorical resonance in living men digging holes where they would in time die. The lines of trenches on the Western Front covered only about 400 miles as the crow flies, but because of the endless zigzagging, the trenches themselves may have run as much as 25,000 miles. miles. But the stalemate of trench warfare wasn't seen on every front, especially at the beginning of the war. There was a lot of offensive movement, especially in the initial German strikes, especially on the Eastern Front, where the Germans were very successful against the Russians, who had a large but pretty hapless army. Also for the...
So why is World War I the first World War? Because after the addition of the United States becoming involved, and of course Canada is in the United Kingdom, so is Australia, all the European countries, all the major European countries have colonies there in Africa. You really end up seeing involvement by countries from every single continent. Japan had declared war against Germany in 1914 as a system of alliances, and Brazil gets involved from South America. So when it all boils down to it, what actually caused the First World War? I would say the main causes are these four things: militarism, the buildup of large militaries by Russia, by Germany especially, by the system of alliances, by imperialism and intense nationalism, of course what prompted the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. So this is a good way to kind of remember the different causes, the main causes, MAIN being an acronym. And this concludes our ultra-short at-home lecture that I mainly did for you, Athena. But we would have done it in class, but this gave us a way to work through it a lot faster and hopefully answer a few more of your questions in class. And I will see you tomorrow.